Welcome, everybody. My name is Adam Ward. I'm Director of Studies of the IISS, and I'd like to welcome you all to this press conference to mark the opening of the 2014 Shangri-La Dialogue, and also the publication of this IISS Strategic Dossier, a regional assessment of security in Asia. And this dossier reflects and it also builds on discussions that are held every year here at the Shangri-La Dialogue on Regional Security Affairs, and it also expresses research activities at the IISS which are continually ongoing. And with this dossier, and indeed with future editions of the dossier, we hope to help to frame debates on regional security affairs, not by editorializing or opinionating about them, but as it were through fact-based analysis. The dossier aims to get to grips with some of the larger geopolitical themes in the regions, namely the evolving stances of some of the great powers, the way in which middle and smaller powers are adapting to some of those larger geopolitical trends. But we also try to reflect the variety of security dilemmas and challenges and the sort of texture, the rich texture of regional security debates. And so therefore, in the book, you will also see reflections and lengthy essays on questions such as civil-military relations in the People's Republic of China, the maritime dimensions of energy security in the Asia-Pacific, forms of armed conflict currently underway in Southeast Asia, trends in military modernization throughout the region, cybersecurity and indeed insecurity, the evolution of the regional security order and regional security architecture, climate change, and so on. And in addition to those large overarching themes, there are very crisp assessments and detailed assessments of some of the active or latent or potential regional security conflicts, be they on the Korean Peninsula, be they in the Taiwan Strait, are they taking the shape of various maritime disputes that we know a lot about. So it's our hope and also expectation that anyone wanting to gain a thorough appreciation of the drivers of strategic change in this region, and examining the drivers of strategic change is really what the IISS is in the business of doing, will be able to get that kind of an appreciation by consulting this dossier. And I'm very pleased in that context to be joined on the panel here today by some of the people who have contributed to the dossier, and also many of whom will have roles to play in the Shangri-La Dialogue over the course of this weekend. First of all, I'd like to introduce our two Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellows for Asia-Pacific Security, Alex Neal, and to his left, William Chung. They're based in our IISS Asia office here in Singapore, and they're joined by their colleague, Pierre Noël, also based here in Singapore, who's our Senior Fellow for Economic and Energy Security. Then from London, we have Nigel Inkster, who is our Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk. To his right, Christian Lemierre, Senior Fellow for Maritime Security and Naval Forces. Nigel and Christian are both from London. And from our one-woman outpost in Berlin, we have Sarah Rain, who's our Consulting Senior Fellow for Geoeconomics and Strategy, but was formerly based at the Singapore office of the IISS here. What I'm going to ask each of them to do, beginning with Sarah on the far right and moving left to Pierre, is to give us a sense of some of the issues that they hope or expect will come up in the Shangri-La Dialogue over the course of this weekend in the context of some of the matters addressed in the dossier. And then after they've done that for about 2 minutes each, 2 or 3 minutes each, essentially we'll open it up to questions and comments that you might have about the dossier or indeed about the dialogue. So, Sarah, over to you.
Well, I suppose one of the things I'll be looking at is the conflicting trends, if you like, in China-ASEAN relations, and trying to take a sort of metric of the gap between rhetoric and reality. Because thinking back, and we mentioned it in the dossier, to October last year in the China-ASEAN summit, we had Lee talking on the 10th anniversary of China-ASEAN strategic relationship about upgrading China-ASEAN relations from what he called a golden decade to a diamond decade. We had him pushing for a treaty of good neighbourliness. And yet, in the wake, in the months that have followed, we have seen increasing pressure on the Philippines, the riling, if you like, of Indonesia. Of course, the situation in the East China Sea with Japan. We've seen the public blaming, if you like, of the Malaysian government for its handling of the Malaysian Airlines tragedy. And now, of course, we have the serious situation in the South China Sea with Vietnam. And so I suppose one of the questions I have is, to some extent, to what extent Lee's idea of a treaty of good neighbourliness is dead in the waters of the South China Sea. I'll also be looking, I think, a little bit for signs of room for de-escalation, because looking forward now to November, China, of course, in November will be hosting the APEC summit, which one would presume they would want to be able to carry off successfully, and that will, of course, presumably involve being able to welcome Prime Minister Abe with a certain degree of cordiality to Beijing.
Thanks. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security, and that means I will be looking almost entirely to things that happen at sea, and the chapter I worked on in the dossier was focused on maritime security as well. And I think in the context of the dialogue and also this dossier, the sea is in many ways the medium in which various confrontations are being played out, but it's also a medium for potential collaboration between the various states in the region as well. So on the one hand, with a more confrontational aspect, we have what's going on in the South China Sea at the moment with the Sino-Vietnamese standoff around an oil rig, the development of Johnson South Reef by China to build an airstrip, Sino-Philippine occasional spats as well. So this weekend, I think it will be very intriguing to see whether there are notes of conciliation or any blame that's being placed at the doors of anyone else by the various defense ministers that are involved. In the East China Sea, again, an area of confrontation between China and Japan and an indicator of the broader Sino-Japanese relationship. It will be interesting to see whether Prime Minister Abe or Onodera-san, a defense minister, make any reference to the East China Sea and how robust their rhetoric is around Japan's reinterpretation of the constitution, remilitarization, and more active foreign policy. But on the cooperative side of things, I think there are key elements here within the dialogue as well, and also within the dossier. One is the fact that climate change is on the agenda in one of the breakout sessions, and this is an area around which many of the countries in the region can coalesce, in which they have very many shared strategic goals. Equally, maritime security more broadly, particularly areas of maritime crime and military operations that involve humanitarian assistance and disaster response in the maritime, are key areas for potential collaboration for states in the region as well. And HADR has been the role around which most militaries have decided to begin their collaboration with very limited or patchy amounts of success so far, but it still remains the focus for military collaboration in the region. So seeing how far countries push collaboration and cooperation in those areas of climate change, maritime security, and HADR, I think will be a good indicator of the desire to dampen down any tensions and build confidence amongst each other as well.
The topic I want to primarily address is not one that has its own separate item on this year's agenda, but is implicit in a lot of the security discussion that are going to take place over this weekend, and this is the topic of cybersecurity, on which there is a chapter in the strategic dossier. Cybersecurity, I think, has increasingly come to the forefront of the preoccupations of most states in the world now, in terms of a growing awareness of the importance of cybersecurity and the detrimental consequences of not paying it adequate attention. Within this region, you have one might call a critical mass of countries that have pretty developed cyber capabilities, but you also have quite a lot of countries that are still on the wrong side of the digital divide. And so there is quite a lot of disparity, both in terms of capabilities, but also in terms of approaches to the whole issue of cybersecurity. I think the main topic, the main area where this is likely to be a factor, or at least will underpin the discussion, is, of course, in the relationship between China and the United States, where over the last 18 months, issue of cybersecurity has been responsible for perhaps some of the greatest and growing levels of mistrust between these two important countries. We have seen the United States raising publicly the issue of what they characterize as state-sponsored industrial espionage on an industrial scale. We have seen the Chinese reaction to the Snowden revelations, and within the last few days, we have seen the US Department of Justice open formal indictments against 5 officials of the Chinese Signals Intelligence Agency, 3PLA, on charges of cyber espionage. And these developments, I think, have played an important and in many ways detrimental role in Sino-US relations. But of course, it's not just the United States and China. Many other countries are very active in what is both a domain in its own right and a domain that increasingly shapes and influences conduct in all the other security domains, air, sea, land, and space. Countries like Japan, South Korea are pretty significant cyber powers in their own right, as indeed is North Korea, notwithstanding the virtual absence of external connectivity that the citizens of that country suffer from. So this is, as I said, going to be an important implicit aspect of this year's discussions. Last year we did have a separate session on cybersecurity. We will do so in future years.
Thank you.
I think one of the overarching themes of this dossier, and also reflective of quite a media buzz that I've detected over the last 48 hours, is Chinese President Xi Jinping's new vision for a distinctly Asian security architecture. The dossier itself, in its conclusion, remarks that China is a thread throughout all of the research that we've undertaken. We've talked about, as Sarah suggested, there's local bilateral spats in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But overriding all of this is the strategic rivalry between the United States, which is operating its hub and spokes alliance system, and that of a rising China. And 2 weeks ago, on the 21st of May, at the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, Xi Jinping unveiled his new vision for an Asian security architecture which will be managed by Asians in Asia. I think this may suggest an exclusion of Western interests in the security of Asia. So I'm going to be looking at how that theme emerges throughout the dialogue and how the debate emerges as to whether there is, in the Chinese term, a maodun, an inherent maodun across the Asia-Pacific region. I think, in addition, one important factor is Xi Jinping's new role as the chairman of the Central National Security Commission. This is a new central mechanism, a central organ of state in Zhongnanhai, and it was rolled out at the third-party plenum last November. More recently, the Central National Security Commission has again come up onto the radar screen with ongoing violence in China, particularly in Xinjiang. And I'll be looking to see whether or not the National Security Commission will come up in terms of its external security concerns rather than specifically internal security concerns for China.
Yes, thank you. Alex and I, in our kind of far outpost in Singapore from London, we explore mainly issues that are related to the Shangri-La Dialogue, and that goes pretty much for all the chapters that are covered in the strategic dossier this year. I'd like to highlight to latch on to what was said at the debate earlier, what Professor Tommy Cole said about China needs to be, to give the world confidence that it will be a responsible citizen and respect international law, and his recommendations that one, China take the Diaoyu Islands Senkaku dispute to arbitration, and Japan to admit the dispute. I support the recommendations, but I think there are three implicit dilemmas that come with the recommendations, like what Alex has said. China, Xi Jinping at the KICA conference in Shanghai recently, by saying that Asia should be managed by Asians for Asians in Asia, is essentially a declaration of independence from 60 years of the American presence in the Asia Pacific and the benefits that flow from that presence. And I'm not sure if many Asian countries, in particular the Philippines and Vietnam, would buy into such a new thesis by China. Secondly, the US has made it very clear that it takes no position on territorial disputes, but there is irony, there's a paradox in such a position, as Major General Tu Zhenhu mentioned during the debate earlier, which is that you cannot not take a position on a territorial dispute and yet maintain a security guarantee to your allies, which are involved in territorial disputes. Number three, Japan. Let me give you a fly on the wall perspective of what Shinzo Abe might say in the next 30 minutes, which is essentially Japan will advises that no country in the Asia Pacific resort to coercion, use of force, but respect international law. I bet my bottom dollar that he will say that during his speech. But there's a problem with such an approach because, number one, Japan refuses to admit the dispute, and that's causing a lot of intensified tensions in the East China Sea. And number two, the Chinese might overplay the history card at times, but I believe that Abe's visits to Yasukuni and the general Japan LDP approach to historical issues warrants concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm an energy person. I wrote the energy chapter in the dossier, and I suspect that when we hear the word energy during the Shangri-La Dialogue, it will probably be about, in the context of discussions about what's going on between China and Vietnam, this oil rig that triggered this pretty serious incident. However, this is not really what I consider to be the really strategic security or intersections between security and energy in Asia. The really strategic issue is related to what my two colleagues, Alex and William, have talked about, which is this very broad, far-reaching, historically important transition between a US-dominated security landscape or architecture or mechanism or whatever you want to call it, and something that is going to be different because of the massive redistribution of power and the rise of China. And that is what is really important for energy, because the reality that defines global energy markets today is that Asia, and China in particular, but Asia in general, are becoming the center of gravity of international energy markets. Asia represents the bulk of the growth in global energy consumption, but actually Asia's imports rise even faster than consumption, because simply because production in the region grows much less than consumption. So at the same time, you have North American imports, and especially US imports, that are falling very rapidly. US oil imports have been more than halved in the past 6 years and a half. And that's also very important historically. So you have this scissors effect where the reliance of North America on globally traded energy is reducing rapidly when Asia's call on the market is rising very quickly. So this in itself is not a problem. Energy security in its naval security aspects mostly calls for cooperation. It's a problem that has many aspects of a public good, and so it should be conducive to cooperation between all the powers in the region and outside of the region to provide security to those markets on which Asia increasingly relies. However, and this is where I connect with where I started from, you have very serious security issues or even crises in the region that perhaps prevent energy from becoming completely a rationale for cooperation. So what I will be looking for during the dialogue is hints of whether the global, the overall strategic situation in the region goes towards some sort of an accommodation between the rising power and the relatively diminishing power, or whether this transition is going to create more tensions rather than less, because that's what's important for energy eventually.
Thanks very much. So there we had three opening salvos, six rather, opening salvos. And we're now going to open it up to you to ask questions. I think we have a roving microphone, is that right? Nobody here? But if you'd like to put your hand up and identify yourself when you're called, and then we'll do our best to answer. Yes, you in the second row here. No, the lady in front of you. Yes.
Thank you very much for this really good openings. Thank you. Thank you. I have three very short questions. First goes to Christian. You spoke about maritime security and primarily non-traditional challenges in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. I was wondering, a lot of talk actually, recently there was a Jakarta International Defense Dialogue was about the issue of maritime security in terms of fishing rights and infringement there, so you have a lot of conflicts overlapping. I was wondering if that issue of infringements of fishing rights and kind of like a little bit not so public dispute, if that would heat up actually the conflicts, or if we would see some areas for cooperation, because you said this would be the area for cooperation. Second, very short to Sarah, you spoke about the good neighborliness, and there are two scenarios in the moment that describe Chinese actions. One is a very realist scenario, basically using the Crimea crisis to create fait accompli in the region. The other one is that they still probably don't really know how to treat with their neighbors, particularly with smaller countries, and how to, having come out of the humiliation, to basically share sovereignty and do issues like this. What would be your take on this? Why is China acting like it is in the moment? Is it kind of creating fait accompli or not really knowing what to do? And finally, to Alex and William, thanks very much. I wanted to ask you about this Asian security community. In Europe, NATO only worked because the US was also involved, because otherwise countries would not have accepted Germany. How would you see Xi Jinping's idea about not having the US involved in an Asian community? Would that be manifesting a dynamic instability? Thanks very much.
Okay, three questions addressed to four people. We'll have to keep it.
So I think it's a fair point to mention fishing rights, and fishing is an area of key strategic importance for various countries, particularly countries such as Vietnam, which relies for about 25% of the population's protein intake on fish from the South China Sea. So there's a very great strategic import there. It's an area where there has been cooperation, an area of potential collaboration, as we saw with the Japanese-Taiwanese fishing accord last year in the East China Sea, following the nationalization of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands by Japan. But equally, we regularly see arrests of fishermen within the South China Sea, and it was the arrest of a Chinese fishing trawler captain in 2010 that sparked off a recent round of East China Sea tensions. The Philippines, the arrest of a Chinese fisherman just a month ago, was equally fractious. So yes, I think fishing rights, because it's currently as relatively zero-sum in terms of who has the rights to fishing, given the rights that are laid down in UNCLOS within an exclusive economic zone, makes it difficult to see how they will currently collaborate on fishing. That doesn't mean it's impossible. In a book that Sarah and I wrote last year, in fact, on the South China Sea, we suggested that there could be collaboration on maritime areas of maritime development, such as fishing, to include a multilateralization of China's current unilateral fishing ban every year, which would be an excellent signal sent by all the states, and perhaps joint constabulary efforts to monitor that fishing ban as well. So there are steps that could be taken. It just doesn't seem the political will is currently there to take them.
why is China acting like it is? It's the big question. If we know why, then we can come up with the right strategy for managing these tensions. One theory, of course, is that there was a considerable disappointment in Beijing in the wake of the Obama visit and his perceived failure to try harder to dampen down regional tensions. And with the allegation, and I think you saw this in a Xinhua editorial yesterday, that he's sort of inadvertently actually fueling anti-Chinese behavior in the region. This is, of course, the perception from Beijing. So one theory is that this is all about undercutting US credibility in the eyes of its allies by exposing the difference between, again, US rhetoric and US realities. Because if you have a billion-dollar platform, the question is, why do you deploy it on the timing that you did? I mean, this has been ready for a while, so why pick now to do it? And it's very difficult to not see that as in some way linked to the Obama visit and US strategy more widely. The question, though, is whether what makes good sense tactically, and I would argue it does make good sense tactically, actually in the longer run is sensible strategically, or whether actually what you're not doing is pushing neighbours who are suspicious of each other actually to cooperate more with each other and driving them, therefore, closer together and closer to the US.
On the question of whether or not Xi Jinping's vision is really to exclude the United States from the region, I think this may have been prompted by Obama's recent tour of Asia, which was to the exclusion of China and was, in my view, a rebalanced, buttressing effort. I think the big question, though, is whether or not Xi Jinping has the confidence of other Asian nations in the region and their view that the time is right for the United States to be absent in the region as the only security guarantor. So there is the possibility, I think, for quite a considerable strategic miscalculation. And some of this goes back to 2008 and the question of the global financial collapse emanating from the United States and subsequently Europe. And there was a great deal of hubris and talk about declinism in the region, the decline of the influence of the United States. There are also issues of sequestration for the Department of Defense in the region, and there are questions about the US being able to maintain its access not just in Northeast Asia, but now more pointedly in Southeast Asia. So the big question is whether or not the strategic calculus in Zhongnanhai, at the hub of Chinese power, is whether or not the time is now ripe. And it's linked into this another debate about whether or not the hide or bide strategy has been at least abandoned for the most part, or at least revised by the Chinese strategic community and endorsed by the Politburo.
Okay, I think the question is China's role in kind of multilateral institutions and what kind of multilateral institutions will eventuate. I think, academics and scholars spend countless hours and debating on like the state of Asia-Pacific security architectures, whether it's going to be hegemony, whether it's going to be multilateral, whether it's going to be hub and spokes. I think we should take the region as it is and not what it should be. Let me give you an example. If you look at China, it doesn't really care what is the regional order, whether it's the EAS or the ASEAN Regional Forum or the various other permutations you're talking about. I think one of the lessons in geopolitics I learned was from US Prime Minister. If you read about Sir Humphrey Appleby telling James Hacker that Britain does not want to be in the European Union, but it is in the European Union because it wants to make a dog's or pig's breakfast of the whole thing. So, China doesn't really want to be in multilateral institutions, but it is in multilateral institutions because it's pursuing its own national interests. And so we got to see how China pursues these national interests, whether it's in or out of multilateral institutions. And we saw it in China's influence in Cambodia at the ASEAN meeting in July 2012, And we see it in China peddling its influence in American allies like Australia and the Republic of Korea. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's take some additional questions, rapid fire ones, hopefully. Yes, you, sir.
Yeah,
Third
Graham
row.
DeBell from ASPI in Canberra. Very quick question. How much has the Institute now moved to the idea that what we're seeing in Asia can be described as an arms race, a naval arms race? How much have you moved, as your last two chapters point, from what has been the conventional view that it's a modernisation? How much do you now accept that it or see it as an arms race?
Okay. Any other questions? We can take them in a batch. Everybody's being very timid. Okay, in that case, naval arms race, Christian.
Yeah, this is a topic that comes up periodically. I think the phrase arms race is one that's loaded with lots of historical baggage, and for that reason needs to be very clearly defined. I think what we see in Asia at the moment certainly has elements of military procurement competition. There are certainly action-reaction dynamics to some of that military procurement competition. I would question whether it has, to some extent, the rapidity with which one would normally categorize an arms race, or the clarity that an arms race might necessitate. So, for instance, we see in Japan the first defense budget increase 2 years ago for more than a decade, and the largest defense budget increase last year for 20 years, but it's still a defense budget that's at 1% of GDP. And even though Abe has stated they'll increase defense budget spending for the next 5 years, that's at a total of 5% or 1% a year, which is an extremely low. If that's a race, everyone's running very slowly. I also wonder whether one can classify it as an arms race when there's really only one horse in the race, and that's China. China now has a defense budget twice as large as Japan's and far larger than any of the other Southeast Asian states as well. So while states are buying key military platforms such as submarines that are clearly designed to deter or disrupt China's surface dominance, I do question whether the phrase arms race is a correct one to describe what's happening.
Thank you.
The Institute is a wonderful organisation in that it has a range of opinions within it, and there is no one Institute view. So Dr. Tim Huxley in Singapore, for instance, will say quite rightly, there's no reason why one has to have bilateral dynamics to an arms race. You can have many arms races happening at one time in the region. I'd certainly see that point. I just am slightly more cautious in using the phrase arms race to describe what is essentially a relatively slow-moving military procurement competition in the region, with states that in many cases have extremely poor military capabilities and certainly naval capabilities, and are unable to compete on a peer-to-peer level with China. I will say that one area in which there is a potential for an arms race is a Sino-US relationship, because the US is the only country really that has the capabilities or the potential to compete with China on a peer-to-peer basis. Now that race doesn't currently exist between China and the US, and in fact what we see with the rebalance is a very cautious, tentative attempt to deter by the US without provoking. But if there was to be a much more intense bilateral competition between the two countries, one could see in the future the potential for a race there.
Okay, any final questions? If not, all of the panelists are going to be obviously around for the rest of the weekend. I'm sure they'll be very happy to talk to anybody here bilaterally, if not in this particular setting. So thank you very much for coming. Hope you benefit from reading the dossier, and I hope you get a lot out of the Shangri-La Dialogue this weekend. Thank you.